Hi guys. This online narrated PowerPoint lecture replaces our normal Wednesday class, which we had the second test during. So to complete the chapter 8 in peace and quiet and without stress, let's do it online and you can watch it at your leisure convenience. If you remember, we discussed 3 key points from this chapter. We spent all of Monday defining race and ethnicity and try to understand what it means that they're socially constructed. In particular, we looked at how different countries define racial categories in rather different ways. And then we also looked how the official US racial categories, as recorded by the US Census, have changed over centuries. And so you could see that what we quote unquote see as a given in terms of racial classification is in fact a lot better viewed as reflecting specific historical, economic, social, and political factors. And in this online video, I will cover the last 2 points. We will define what racism, prejudice, and discrimination are, and briefly touch on whether we can consider them a thing of the past in the United States. And in just one slide, I am going to effectively highlight some of the life chances stories related to race and ethnicity, and I will ask you to read in more detail in the textbook in the sections on life chances. Okay, so let's first look at the basic demographics. The US is changing with respect to racial and ethnic composition quite drastically. So this is a really nice chart which shows the percent of the total US population by race and ethnicity from 1960 through now up until 2060, so 100 years. The red color represents non-Hispanic whites. The blue color represents blacks, non-Hispanic blacks. Green color represents Hispanics. Purple is Asian, and other is orange. So what can we see? In 1960, when your parents or grandparents were growing up, 85% of the US population was non-Hispanic white. 10% was black and 4% was other. So the country was predominantly non-Hispanic white. In just 50 years, that's 2 generations, that's a very short time demographically, the proportion of whites dropped from 85% to 64%, and the category that primarily replaced the white category is Hispanics, Asians, and others. You will notice that the category of non-Hispanic blacks stays more or less stable, 10 to 13% over 100 years. So it's primarily Hispanics that are growing and Asians. So by the time that you guys are in your later adulthood, whites are going to be numerically the minority in the United States. But as we discussed, the term minority does not refer to a racial ethnic minority, does not refer to the numbers as much as the access to power and resources. So whites may be numerically in the minority, but politically and sociologically, they will most likely remain the majority. Okay. So now, given these large changes, is race still relevant today? We have a biracial or black president. We have very influential people in the entertainment industry, like Oprah Winfrey. There's Jay-Z, who is the CEO of Rock Nation with a net worth of over $400 million. There is one of our presidential candidates, Bill Carson. Ursula Burns is a CEO of Xerox and ranked among the top 15 most influential women in the world. And then we have Serena and Venus Williams, of course, tennis players. So given that we have these examples, can we say there is still racism and prejudice and discrimination? And the answer is yes. And I will document that in a few places. And the important thing is to think of these people in the slide as exceptions rather than the norm. And that's why we cannot point to these extremely successful people and say, see, they haven't faced obstacles or there's no more racism. Now, however, there is something that I do want to point out. I'll show you a graph that tells a really, really startling story. It's a little complex graph, so we'll work through it slowly. How do we meaning all Americans, or in this case, Black and white Americans, understand what's happening in terms of racial bias? So this figure comes from a very influential study by Norton and Summers. If you want, the whole study is at the website listed at the bottom. You can download that PDF. And this was a study where the authors asked a sample of American whites and blacks a series of questions. They asked, in the 1950s, was there much anti-white or anti-black bias? And respondents responded from 1, not at all, or up to 10, very strong bias. Okay, so what we see here on the x-axis, we have time from 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Again, this is not when people were asked, but current or sort of in recent years, people were asked, do you think in the 1960s this was the situation, in the 70s, etc. The gray lines are the answers of whites. The black lines are the answers of blacks. So let's walk through this. This solid black line on top is how blacks respond to questions about anti-black bias. So blacks say in the 1950s there was extremely strong anti-black bias. Okay, and blacks say over the course of decades this has decreased quite significantly. That's the black line. Under that line is a solid gray line. That's the same question answered by whites. So whites were asked, how much anti-black bias was there in the 1950s and etc. And you can see that there is general agreement that in the 1950s there was extremely strong anti-black bias. Both black and white respondents agree that this was occurring. Whites report that they think the anti-black bias has decreased more strongly than blacks do. The dotted lines represent how much anti-white bias there is. So everybody says in the 1950s there wasn't really any anti-white bias. Both black respondents and white respondents agree. The very bottom line, that dashed black line, corresponds to answers that black respondents give about anti-white bias. So black respondents are asked, is there anti-white bias now and was there before? And by and large, black respondents say, maybe not really. But the gray dashed line is really startling in recent years. That's the line where white respondents are asked, is there anti-white bias? And notice what happens in the 2000s. In the 2000s, white respondents think there is more anti-white bias than anti-black bias. There is a number of studies that asked similar questions, and by and large, Black and Hispanic respondents recognize that there is bias against their groups and that there is not much bias against white groups. But whites, by and large, by now, on average, believe there is more bias against their group than against blacks. So unfortunately, there has been a lot of attitudinal changes and improper or incorrect perceptions that are yielding this very, very unusual set of beliefs. And just one last comment about this graph. If you notice what blacks believe, that those are the dark black lines, they, in better correspondence to reality, responded there is a lot more anti-black bias than anti-white bias, even today. So that's just makes it a little more difficult to discuss racism when the majority of Americans, the whites, believe that they're being discriminated against when evidence does not point to this. Okay, so now that we use the term, or I use the term discrimination, so let's define these. Okay, so racism is the belief, and I'm highlighting the word belief, that meaning not behavior, but belief or attitude, that some race is inherently superior to some other race or races. That's the general definition. We should point out that because the definition of race in the popular opinion is linked to genetic differences, incorrectly, but it is, this belief about racism then is fed by claims of genetic differences. What this means is racism is the belief that some group is inherently, somehow biologically superior to some other race groups. So this is a really insidious set of deep-seated incorrect beliefs. Now, I guess one thing I should point out, today's level and the specific directions of racism has not always been the case. When you look at Europe prior to 19th century, 18th century, or even medieval times, this really was not, there were all kinds of beliefs, all kinds of incorrect beliefs, all kinds of in-group, out-group issues and stereotypes, but racism was not really prominent. So one explanation why racism has become so prominent is that it has been developed to justify exploitation of people in colonies in Asia and Africa by Europeans, and also in the US, the slavery system. In other words, people try to morally justify why they're subjugating other peoples, and if the answer is, well, they're inferior to us, they're not, we're helping them, or they need us, or some other set of claims, then it becomes justifiable to do so. So this is likely the origin of the predominant or the prevalent racism in the Western countries today. And it is still used to justify existing inequalities, the claims about superiority of groups. So that's racism. Okay, now let's talk about prejudice and discrimination. Those go hand in hand often, but let's define them nice and precisely. So prejudice is defined as an, again, attitude, typically negative, but can be positive, about characteristics of a group, and importantly, which is applied to the individuals that are members of that group. So let me step back a little bit. We know the term stereotype. Those are just beliefs about groups, right? So those beliefs sometimes are correct, sometimes are incorrect. So here in these pictures, we have a picture that would correspond to a stereotype that Blacks are good at either music or dancing or whatever, and Asians are good at math or sciences, right? Those are stereotypes. Once those stereotypes are applied to a person, that's called prejudice. In other words, a child in school who is of Chinese origin or Chinese American, the teachers, if they say, oh, that child is Chinese, therefore this child will be good at math, that is prejudice. In this case, it could be positive, but it also could be negative, as it constrains the options for this child to focus on things other than what they're assumed to be good at. Okay, so that's prejudice, which is, again, an attitude or belief. In contrast, discrimination refers to behaviors directed at other groups and their individual members. So racism and prejudice are various beliefs and attitudes, whereas discrimination has to do with actions or behaviors. Discrimination is often motivated by prejudice. So if I believe that Joe is member of some racial ethnic group and therefore is not good at, say, math, then maybe teachers may discriminate, or um, people around them may discriminate because they believe that you know, whatever characteristics that applies to their group based on the stereotype applies to Joe personally. However, it doesn't have to be motivated by prejudice. So a nice way to think about this is individual discrimination is by one person against a person. The examples that I've used so far were of the individual type of discrimination, where a teacher treats a student a certain way, or a potential employer treats an applicant a certain way, or etc. Okay, but even more insidious is what we call institutional discrimination. So this is systematic discrimination, which is built into what we call normal functioning of social institutions. Let me give you a couple of examples. Let me give you two examples, and then so we understand a little bit better what we mean. A really strong example of institutional discrimination was the set of Jim Crow laws in the South of the United States. So you're probably familiar with them, but just so after the Reconstruction period in the 1870s, the 10 or 11 southern states that used to be the members of the Confederacy gradually enacted a set of laws which robbed blacks of the ability to take part in political life. So there were voting laws that made it very difficult for whites to vote. If they were not registered to vote, they could not become elected into any kind of political function. And so gradually, blacks were excluded from the political life, and states started passing segregation laws, which segregated employment, segregated education, segregated housing, segregated transportation. And these laws were on the books by and large until the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So this has truly institutionalized discrimination to an extreme. And so what we mean is a person who might be not prejudiced at all still has to abide by the laws, which have been built into the social institutions, and discriminate against black applicants, maybe because they could not by law work side by side with white workers. So that was a historical, probably the most pronounced example of institutional discrimination. But institutional discrimination can occur or occurs on a regular basis today. So let me give you an example. Some kind of financial institution is hiring people, and the hiring is based on by people who are not prejudiced. Okay, but they're looking for somebody who is a good fit to the company. That makes sense, right? They want somebody who will be a good worker and good fit with others. Well, if due to historical circumstances, it's likely that in these financial institutions, the majority of workers will be white. If that's the case, then who is likely to be a better fit? Another white person, an applicant who went maybe to similar colleges, comes from similar parts of the country, maybe is interested in similar sports, similar music, etc. Or a black applicant or Hispanic applicant who attended perhaps different schools, come from different parts of the country, and are more different. So in this case, Black and Hispanic applicants may be discriminated against, not because the hiring people are prejudiced, but simply because of historical discrimination, um, has changed social institutions to a point where now, for their normal functioning, systematic discrimination occurs. So, good fit is one of standard ways how implicitly or unwittingly Black and Hispanic applicants, or applicants who are different in other ways, may be discriminated against. Okay, so it's important then to point out that discrimination can occur without prejudice, although it typically goes hand in hand. Okay. Now, how about life chances? What influence does race and ethnicity have on our lives? It turns out that race and ethnicity influence just about all aspects of our lives. In your textbook on page 228, there's up until about 232, there's a set of statistics about various aspects. So I'm not going to repeat this, but race and ethnicity influences education. By and large, education in the US is still very highly segregated, and minority schools, so schools with a majority minority students, tend to be underfunded, have less experienced teachers, and a greater proportion of children who have higher needs. And so education is lower quality by and large. Okay, and then correspondingly, you have lower educational attainment for Black and Hispanics students in particular, lower college attendance, and especially in recent times, lower college graduation. So people will attend college but are not able to finish. Family. There are large differences, especially between Black and white families in terms of marriage rates, which are much lower for Black adults. Times, age at marriage, so average age at marriage, and to some degree, some differences in fertility. There are huge differences in health and longevity. In particular, Black and Hispanic adults live, in particular, Black adults live shorter lives by about 5 years than whites. And the other end of the life course spectrum, we are watching the documentary about neonatal outcomes among Blacks and whites. I probably should point out the reason why I corrected myself and said Hispanics are not shown to have shorter lifespans than whites is a very, very complicated story having to do with data constraints and immigrant status of Hispanics. So if you're interested, I'm happy to chat about it, but for now, let's exclude that from this lecture. Healthcare. There are tremendous differences in healthcare provided to whites, Blacks, and Hispanics. For instance, we know that pain is less strongly medicated in Blacks than in whites. Those differences are fairly highly significant. Of course, there are differences in the quality of healthcare in general due to the quality of health insurance and availability of doctors near one's neighborhood. Criminal justice, which we have already discussed. Work. And here, for work in particular, I'll mention one experiment that's been done in the last 10 years. So Diva Pager is currently at Harvard, but she was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin, interested in race and inequality. And she developed the following experiment. She was interested in how race and criminal record intersect in chances for employment. She hired college students to pose as job applicants. All were men, young men, some were white and some were Black. And some were to pose as all of them were to pose as adults with about high school graduation and not much work experience. And some of them posed as people with criminal record. They um, had they claimed to have had 18 months in prison due to, I think, drug possession, and some did not. And then she looked at what job offers they received after their interviews. And what she found was following. One, it won't surprise you probably that those who posed as having criminal record were about 50% less likely to receive an offer of employment. This effect was even more pronounced among blacks. But what was the biggest shocker of this experiment was that black men who had no criminal record had a lower chance of being hired than whites who had 18 months in prison, who had a criminal record. And Diva Pager followed up this shocking finding with interviews with the employers. And they did not believe they were prejudiced, and they tried to be fair, but they acted on their stereotypes about the groups. They were looking for best workers, and when that was coupled with stereotypes about black and white male young workers, they ended up inadvertently discriminating against young black job applicants. So the point of this is that when you read about lower employment rates among blacks and lower incomes, it's important to keep in mind that this is a complicated outcome of educational system that fails black children in much higher rates than white children, discrimination and prejudice in the workplace, and many other factors that are influencing these outcomes. Okay. And one last point in which that I'll mention is neighborhood and housing, and in particular segregation. Segregation is the separation of race and ethnic groups, which was part of laws in many U.S. states, as I'd mentioned during the Jim Crow laws. But segregation has not disappeared. So what I want to, I'll read from a study that was done fairly recently by the National Fair Housing Alliance. And what they did was over a course of about a year, they sent white and black testers who posed as home buyers in different cities across the country. And they contacted a real estate company. So in one case, so this was one of the cities was Jackson, Mississippi. And what they found was that real estate agents often declined to show properties to black customers, even if they were better qualified than whites with higher incomes, better credit scores, and more savings for down payment. Interestingly enough, the real estate agents enforce segregation by steering white testers who expressed interest in properties in majority black city or black areas. They were steered into white communities and white schools. So all over the country, real estate agents showed fewer homes to black and Latino testers, even if they were better qualified than white testers. The black and Latinos were often denied information about special incentives that could make purchasing easier. Black and Latino testers were required to produce loan pre-approval letters that whites were not. And again, by steering all these testers towards their specific whites towards white majority areas and blacks toward black majority areas, they effectively enforce residential and school segregation. So all of these, and if you're interested, I'm happy to share the original study with you, and I'm also very happy to share more studies on any of these outcomes. These are extremely well documented, and so I'm happy to give you interesting readings if you want. So by and large, the answer is there are large and persistent, and in some cases growing race and ethnic disparities in terms of life chances that are afforded to their members. And I think I will stop here. I will just point out that on your own, you might want to read the theoretical perspectives. You may discuss perhaps in SI, or you can ask if you want how interactions produce one's race identity. Oh, sorry, there's a typo there. And then the race relations section in the textbook is very clearly written, so make sure that you at least have some understanding of the definitions of genocide, population transfer, colonialism, assimilation, and pluralism and multiculturalism. So thank you for listening. And I'm glad we were able to wrap up the chapter, at least in this online way. And I look forward to seeing you in class on Monday.